My grandfather died 3 months ago and left me an envelope that I was not allowed to open until today. And inside that envelope was a letter with only 3 sentences: land on Big Ben at exactly 12 noon on October 15th. Deliver this package to the man in the red coat, and you will understand everything your family has hidden from you for 60 years. And attached to that letter was a key, a faded photograph of a woman I had never seen before, and coordinates that pointed to the top of the most iconic clock tower in London. And I am a pilot. I have landed planes in storms, in crosswinds, on aircraft carriers in the middle of the ocean. But nothing in my training prepared me for this. My name is James Whitmore. I am 29 years old, and this is the story of how I landed a plane on Big Ben to uncover a family secret that changed everything. I thought I knew about my grandfather, about my family, and about why some promises take 60 years to keep. Because when I opened that package, when I met the man in the red coat, when those 12 bells rang out across London, I discovered that my entire life had been built on a lie, and that sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to finish what they started, even if it means breaking every law in England, even if it means risking everything, even if it means learning truths you wish you never knew. My grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, was a war hero, everyone said. So he flew Spitfires in World War II, shot down 17 German planes, was decorated by Churchill himself, and came home to England a legend. And he never talked about the war, never told stories, never went to reunions, and whenever anyone asked him about those years, he would just smile, that sad, distant smile, and say some things are better left in the past. And we all thought he was being humble, being British about it. But now I know he was hiding something. He died on July 12th, a heart attack in his sleep, peaceful, they said. And at his funeral, hundreds of people came, veterans, politicians, strangers, who said he saved their lives. And I stood there listening to speech after speech about how brave he was, how heroic. And I felt proud, but also confused, because the grandfather I knew was quiet, reserved, almost haunted. And there was always something in his eyes, like he was looking at something the rest of us could not see. And 3 days after the funeral, his lawyer called me and said, "Your grandfather left specific instructions for you and only you." The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper sealed with red wax like something from another century. And on the front, in my grandfather's shaky handwriting, it said, "To be opened by James on October 15th, 2024, at sunrise, not before." And I remember holding that envelope and feeling its weight and thinking what could possibly be so important that it needed to wait 3 months. And why me? Why not my father or my uncle? Why a grandson he barely knew? Because my grandfather and I were not close. He lived alone in that old house in Dover, and I visited maybe twice a year out of obligation more than love. But I waited. I kept that envelope in my desk drawer, and every day I looked at it and wondered. And on October 15th at sunrise, I sat on my balcony in London with coffee, and finally broke that seal and pulled out the letter. And it was dated the day before he died, like he knew his time was up, and the handwriting was shaky but clear. And it said, "James, I am sorry for the burden I am about to place on you, but you are the only one who can do this, because you are a pilot like I was, and because you are the only one in this family who understands that some debts cannot die with us." The letter explained that during the war in 1943, my grandfather had been shot down over occupied France, and that a French resistance fighter had hidden him for 3 weeks while his wounds healed, and that fighter's name was Colette Rousseau, and she was 19 years old and beautiful and brave. And they fell in love the way people fall in love during wars, desperately, completely knowing that every moment might be their last. And when he finally escaped back to England, he promised her he would come back after the war. He promised they would be married, that they would have the life. The war had stolen from them, but when the war ended, he returned to France and she was gone. He searched for weeks, talked to everyone in the village, showed her photograph, asked questions, and finally someone told him the truth. The Gestapo had arrested Colette 2 days after he escaped. They tortured her for information about the resistance, and when she would not talk, they shot her in the town square and buried her in an unmarked grave. And my grandfather came home, broken, married. My grandmother had my father and lived a good life. But he never forgot Colette, never stopped loving her. And he carried that guilt for 60 years, the guilt of surviving while she died, the guilt of promising to come back and failing. The letter said that before Colette died, she gave something to her sister, something she wanted my grandfather to have. But her sister fled France after the war, and they lost touch. And for decades, my grandfather searched for her, sent letters, hired investigators, and finally 2 years ago he found her living in London. And she agreed to meet him, but only under specific conditions. She would wait at Big Ben on October 15th, at exactly noon, wearing a red coat, and my grandfather had to land a plane on the clock tower as proof that he was still the brave pilot Colette had fallen in love with, because that was what Colette had always said she loved about him, his fearlessness, his willingness to do impossible things. But my grandfather was 86 years old when he found her. He could barely walk, let alone fly. So he made a different plan. He would teach his grandson to do it. He would leave instructions, coordinates, blueprints, everything needed to make that landing. And James, you are that grandson. You are my second chance to keep a promise I made 60 years ago, and I know this is insane. I know you could go to prison. I know you might die. But I also know that you understand what it means to keep promises, because you are my blood, and we do not break our word no matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs. So please, James, finish what I started, land on that tower at noon, meet the sister, and she will give you what Colette wanted me to have, and then you will understand. I sat there on my balcony reading that letter 3 times, 4 times, and I thought my grandfather had lost his mind in his final days, that this was some kind of dementia fantasy. But then I looked in the envelope and found blueprints, actual architectural drawings of Big Ben, showing a maintenance platform at the top that was technically wide enough for a helicopter or a small stall aircraft. And there were calculations, wind speed charts, tide tables, because Big Ben sits right on the Thames and wind patterns are affected by the river. And there were photographs, surveillance photos he had taken of that platform from every angle. And I realized he was serious. He had been planning this for 2 years. I had 48 hours to decide if I was going to do this, and I spent those 48 hours researching everything I could about Big Ben, about London airspace regulations, about STOL aircraft capable of landing in spaces smaller than a tennis court. And the more I researched, the more I realized this was not just insane. It was potentially suicidal, because Big Ben is in the heart of London, right next to Parliament, the most restricted airspace in the country, with radar coverage and fighter jets on standby. And if I violated that airspace, I would have maybe 90 seconds before the RAF scrambled to intercept me. But I could not stop thinking about Colette, about a 19-year-old girl who hid an enemy pilot, risked her life, fell in love, and died protecting the man she loved. And I thought about my grandfather carrying that guilt for 60 years, never telling anyone, living a half-life, because part of his heart was buried in an unmarked grave in France. And I thought about promises, about the ones we keep, and the ones that haunt us when we do not. And I realized I did not really have a choice, because this was not about flying. This was about love and honor, and finishing something that should have been finished 60 years ago. I called in every favor I had. I found a retired RAF pilot named Malcolm, who specialized in vintage aircraft, and I showed him my grandfather's plans. And he looked at me like I was insane and said, "You will go to prison." And I said, "Maybe, but will the plane work?" And he studied the blueprints for a long time and finally said, "Technically, yes. If you use a fuselage, it has a landing distance of less than 60 feet. It can fly at 30 miles per hour without stalling, and it is maneuverable enough to navigate between buildings. But James, you will have one chance, one approach, because the second you enter that airspace, every authority in London will be coming for you." We spent the next week modifying a 1943 Fiesler Storch that Malcolm had restored, the same type of plane my grandfather flew during reconnaissance missions. And we reinforced the landing gear, installed modern avionics and GPS, but kept the original engine because we needed that slow flight capability. And Malcolm taught me to fly it, taught me how to handle the unpredictable winds around tall buildings, how to judge distances when you are surrounded by glass and steel, how to land on a platform barely wider than your wingspan. And every time I practiced, I thought, this is impossible. I am going to die. But then I would think about Colette, and I would try again. I also had to plan the timing, because Big Ben strikes 12 bells at noon, and the whole point was to land exactly as those bells rang, to prove I was the grandson of the pilot. Colette loved to show that the Whitmore family keeps its promises even across generations, even across death, and that meant I needed To time my approach perfectly be overhead, at exactly 11:59 and 45 seconds begin my descent, as the first bell rang and touched down as the 12th bell faded, and the margin for error was 0. If I was 5 seconds early, the sister would not be there. If I was 5 seconds late, I would miss my window and have to abort. The night before the flight, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Engine failure mid-approach, sudden wind shear, structural collapse of the platform, arrest, or worse. And I thought about my grandfather, wondered if he had felt this kind of fear before his missions during the war. And I realized that courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing the thing anyway, because something matters more than your safety. And what mattered more than my safety was keeping a 60-year-old promise to a dead girl who sacrificed everything for love. At dawn on October 15th, I drove to a private airfield outside London, where Malcolm had the torch ready, and he did not say much, just hugged me and said, "Your grandfather would be proud." And I said, "I hope so, Malcolm. I really hope so." And I climbed into that tiny cockpit and started the engine, and the sound was like thunder, like history coming alive. And I thought, this is it. This is the moment where I either become a hero or a cautionary tale. And honestly, I did not care, which as long as I kept the promise. The flight into London took 20 minutes, and I stayed low following the Thames to avoid radar as long as possible, and I could see the city waking up, people on bridges, tourists taking photos, joggers in parks, and none of them knew that in 30 minutes a vintage German aircraft was going to land on the most famous clock tower in England, and I felt this strange calm, like I had stepped outside time, outside normal life, and was living in one of my grandfather's war stories. And I understood then why he never talked about the war. Because how do you explain moments like this to people who have never felt them? At 11:50, I broke from the river and climbed to 500 feet, and immediately alarms started going off in air traffic control towers, and I heard frantic radio calls. "Aircraft near Westminster. Identify yourself. You are in restricted airspace." But I did not respond. I just kept flying toward that clock tower rising ahead of me, golden and massive and impossible. And I thought about Colette seeing my grandfather's Spitfire for the first time. Thought about her climbing onto the wing, pulling him from the cockpit, hiding him in her barn. And I thought some acts of bravery echo across generations, and this was my echo. At 11:58 I was overhead, and I could see the platform at the top of the tower barely visible behind the clock faces, and I could see a figure down there, a woman in a red coat looking up, shielding her eyes from the sun, and I thought, that is her. That is Colette's sister, the last living connection to a love story that was supposed to end 60 years ago, but instead has led to this impossible moment. And I began my descent, cutting power, pulling back, dropping toward that tower, while the city spread below me like a map, like history, like destiny. The approach was the most terrifying minute of my life. The wind around Big Ben was chaotic, swirling, unpredictable, and the tower seemed to grow larger and larger until it filled my entire windscreen, and I could see the clock faces up close. Could see the minute hand moving toward 12, could hear police sirens starting below, and I thought too late to turn back now, and I dropped lower, fighting the Storch's tendency to float in the turbulent air. And then the first bell rang. The sound was massive, deeper than I expected. It vibrated through the airframe, through my chest, and I was at 50 feet, descending at 3 feet per second, and I could see the woman in red clearly. Now she was old, maybe 80. Her face turned up, watching me, and she was crying. And the second bell rang, and I was at 30 feet, and the wind tried to push me sideways, and I corrected hard, right rudder. And the third bell rang, and I was at 20 feet, and I could see the platform as edges, could see how small it was, and doubt flooded my mind. This will not work. I am going over the edge. But the fourth bell rang, and I was committed, and the fifth bell rang, and my wheels were 10 feet from the stone, and the sixth bell rang, and I pulled power to idle, and the seventh bell rang, and I felt the landing gear kiss the platform, and the eighth bell rang, and I hit the brakes, and the ninth bell rang, and we were rolling forward too fast toward the edge, and the 10th bell rang, and I stood on those brakes with everything I had, and the 11th bell rang, and we were still moving, and the 12th bell rang, and we stopped. I sat there for 5 seconds, unable to move, unable to process that I had actually done it. that I had landed a plane on Big Ben at noon, while 12 bells rang just like my grandfather's letter said, and then I saw movement. The woman in red was walking toward the plane, tears streaming down her face, and I opened the cockpit door and climbed out onto the platform 650 feet above London with sirens wailing and helicopters approaching. And she looked at me and said, "Thomas," and I said, "No, Ma'am, I am James, his grandson. Thomas passed away 3 months ago," and she covered her mouth and sobbed and said, "I waited 60 years. I waited so long." Her name was Marie Rousseau. She was 82 years old, and she said Colette was my sister, my beautiful, brave sister. And when she died, I was only 16, and I took what she wanted Thomas to have, and I fled France, and I came to England, and I tried to find him. But his family would not tell me where he was. They said he was married, that he needed to forget the war, forget France, forget Colette. And so I waited, because Colette made me promise that someday, somehow, I would give this to the pilot who saved her life. And she reached into her coat and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside the box was a letter written in French in handwriting that was shaky and smudged with what looked like blood. And Marie said, "Colette wrote this the night before the Gestapo came. She knew they were coming. She knew what would happen, and she wanted Thomas to know the truth." And I said, "What truth, Marie? What could be so important that my grandfather spent 60 years searching for you?" And she looked at me with such sadness and said, "James, your grandfather had a son, and Colette was pregnant when he left France. She never told him because she did not want him to stay out of obligation. She wanted him to survive, to go home, but she was 3 months pregnant, and she planned to tell him after the war." The world stopped. I stood there on top of Big Ben with helicopters circling and police surrounding the tower below, and I could not process what she had just said. And I said, "That is impossible. If my grandfather had a son, someone would know." And Marie shook her head and said, "The baby was born in hiding after Colette died. I delivered him myself in a cellar, while German soldiers searched the streets, and I raised him as my own. I told everyone he was mine, and I named him Thomas after his father. And he grew up never knowing his real mother, never knowing his father was an English war hero." She pulled out a photograph from the box and handed it to me. And it showed a young man, maybe 20 years old, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, and he looked exactly like my grandfather. Same eyes, same smile, same stance. And Marie said, "That is your Uncle James. He is still alive. He lives in Paris. He is a pilot, like his father, like you, and he knows the truth now. I told him 2 years ago when Thomas finally found me, and he wants to meet you. He wants to know his English family. But Thomas wanted to do this first, wanted to prove he never forgot. Colette wanted to land on this tower as a symbol that love never dies, that promises echo across generations." I stood there holding that photograph, holding proof that my family was bigger than I thought, that my grandfather had carried an even heavier burden than I imagined. He lost the woman he loved, lost a son he never knew existed, and lived his entire life with that hole in his heart. And I understood then why he never talked about the war. Because how do you explain that you left a piece of yourself in France, that you have a son? You can never claim that you loved someone more than the life you came home to. And I thought about my grandmother, about my father, about the whole family built on this secret, and I did not know whether to be angry or sad or grateful. Marie said Thomas wanted you to have this, wanted you to know the truth, wanted you to meet your uncle and continue what he started. Because blood matters, James. Family matters, even when it is complicated, even when it is painful. And your grandfather believed you were strong enough to carry this truth, strong enough to bring 2 families together across borders and languages and 60 years of silence. And I looked at her and said, "Why did you make him land on Big Ben? Why something so dangerous?" And she smiled through her tears and said, "Because Colette always said Thomas would fly to the ends of the earth for her, and I needed to know his grandson had that same spirit, that same fearlessness, before I trusted him with this secret." The police arrived, then swarming up the tower stairs, and I knew I was about to be arrested, but I did not care, because I was holding a letter from a dead woman to my grandfather. I was holding a photograph of an uncle I never knew existed, and I was standing on top of one of the most iconic structures in the world, having just completed the most impossible landing of my life. and Marie grabbed my hand and said, "Go to Paris. James, meet your uncle. Tell him his father never stopped loving his mother. Tell him that some loves are so powerful, they create life even in the middle of death." And I nodded and said, "I will, Marie. I promise." And she said, "Good, because the Whitmore family keeps its promises even when it takes 60 years. I was arrested, of course, charged with violating restricted airspace, reckless endangerment, and about 17 other crimes. And my pilot license was suspended, and I paid enormous fines and did community service. But none of that mattered because 3 weeks after the landing, I flew to Paris on a commercial flight as a passenger. And I met my uncle Thomas Rousseau, and he looked so much like my grandfather. It hurt to look at him. And we sat in a cafe near the Louvre, and I gave him the letter, and he read it and cried. And then he told me about his life, about growing up thinking Marie was his mother, about learning the truth about his real parents, about the pilot father he never knew, and the resistance fighter mother who died protecting him before he was born. We spent a week together, my uncle and I, and we flew together in his plane, a vintage Piper Cub, over the French countryside, and he showed me the village where Colette hid. My grandfather showed me the barn where they fell in love, showed me the town square where she was executed, and we stood there in that square, and I felt the weight of history, the weight of choices and consequences, and I thought about how one act of bravery in 1943 had rippled forward through decades and created this moment, created a connection between two families who should have always been one. My uncle gave me something before I left, a ring that had belonged to Colette, a simple silver band that my grandfather had given her as a promise that he would return, and she had been wearing it when she died, and the Gestapo had taken it. But Marie had bought it back years later from a black market dealer and kept it for 60 years waiting to return it to the right person, and my uncle said, "This belongs to your family. James, it belongs to the Whitmore line, and I want you to have it." And I took that ring, and I put it on a chain around my neck, and I have worn it every day since because it reminds me that love is stronger than war, that promises matter, that family is not just the people you grow up with, but the people you discover and choose. The Storch was confiscated by the British government, and I never flew it again. But honestly, I do not need to, because I completed the mission. I kept my grandfather's promise, and I uncovered a truth that changed everything, and now I visit my uncle twice a year, and we fly together, and we talk about the grandfather he never knew, and we honor Colette's memory, and we are building a relationship across borders and languages, proving that family bonds can survive anything, even 60 years of silence, even death, even war. And that is a legacy worth having, worth fighting for, worth landing on Big Ben for, because in the end, the only things that matter are the promises we keep and the family we choose to love.